and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nyambura and this is 100 on Books. Today I'm going to be talking about the books I finished in the week ending 22nd October 2023, and I finished 6 books, so longer than previous or more recent ones. So let's get into it. I'll start by saying I don't usually talk about DNFs because I have a hard time DNFing books, to be honest, but this is significant because it ties in with a project which I tried this year and which is going to be incomplete because of what I'm about to say. This year I wanted to read all the books on the National Book Award long list for young people's literature, and I almost finished it, except for the book I'm about to talk about, which is Gather by Kenneth M. Cado. I hope I'm saying his name right. This book follows a teenage boy as he tries to just get by in, a family that's quite dysfunctional. They're really poor. He doesn't have, any parental supervision at home and so on. And I started reading it and was having such a hard time. I started reading it in the week ending 15th October, right? So I was like, I want to finish this book. This was the second last of the books I had to finish for the NBA long list, but I was really struggling. Then I made the mistake of going online and Googling. And when I tell you, this book has sad event after sad event, and this was happening also during the same time as we are as I speak right now, which is that Israel is, attacking Gaza, and basically we are watching all these atrocities unfold before our very eyes. I couldn't deal. I just could not deal with any more difficult stuff. And I was like, the world is so difficult right now. I don't want to go into literature and encounter the same stuff. And so I put it aside. Another thing that happened is the first book I'm going to talk about now. The first book I finished came in. First book I finished in this week came in. And that book was Huda F Cares by Huda Fahmy. So it came in and it would otherwise would have been the last of the NBA books, but when I saw it and I've enjoyed Huda's style in the past, I was like, well, this is the permission I need to not finish Gather. So that's it. That's a project unfinished. I might read it at some point in the future. I might not, but I had a good run and that's not something to sneer at. So with that said, the first book I finished this week was Huda F Cares by Huda Fahmy. And in this book we follow Huda and her family as they go on a road trip from Michigan, where they live, which is in the north of the US, to Disneyland, which is in the south. Right, and on this trip they're eating food from home and they're praying in public, and Huda is having a really tough time dealing with both of these things, being visibly Muslim, being other, basically. So yeah, that's really what this graphic novel is about, dealing with being other, with being part of a sibling group, and basically what it means to be part of a family, what it means to be a person who practices a certain religion, what it means to be visibly Muslim in America, and all of that. As usual, her style is very, like colorful, and it gets your attention, and she has a great sense of humor. So I really enjoyed this. And because, as I said, I was having a difficult time reading Gather, I went to the library and borrowed 2 more Huda Fahmy titles and read them in quick succession. So those were Yes, I'm Hot in This, The Hilarious Truth About Life in a Hijab, and That Can Be Arranged, a Muslim love story. So Yes, I'm Hot in This is a compilation of her comic strips from her blog, I want to say, called Yes, I'm Hot in This, about like all these different interactions she's had with people who are like just being weird towards her because she wears a hijab, but also the ways in which she's learned to not be weird towards herself about wearing a hijab, and she's learned to accept people who might be curious but are not going to be, for instance, bigoted and stuff like that. So that was quite enjoyable. And then also, as I said, that can be arranged, a Muslim love story, which is basically the story of her journey from being a woman who was like, I don't know about marriage, to meeting her husband and getting married and so on in traditional Muslim fashion, like not dating in the Western way and so on. And I enjoyed it. I think I've read a few books about and watched a few videos about what it's like to go through courtship as a Muslim who's practicing and so on. So it was interesting to read this graphic novel. Then after that, I listened to They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lies That Raised Us by Gupta, which is framed as a collection of letters to her mother, where she basically comes to terms with how she grew up as an Indian American whose father had grown up in Canada, moved to the US, and whose mother had grown up in India and come with her father to the US via Canada. What it meant to be part of a group that's viewed as the model minority in the US, who are viewed as exceptional, who are viewed as high performers, high achievers, and the costs it inflicted on her and her family to be part of this group. It was really insightful and really touching, and it made me go back to her older writing just to find more of her writing and hear more of her voice after I was done. So if you're interested in that immigrant experience and pushing back on these narratives of the model minority, I would recommend They Called Us Exceptional. The next book I finished was Moby Dyke, An Obsessive Quest to Track Down the Last Remaining Lesbian Bars in America by Burton, which I would say is a travelogue as meditation on lesbian bars in the US. So what happened is that Burton found out in the midst of the pandemic that there were only about 20 lesbian bars left in the US, from a high of 200 plus at some point in the 80s. And she was like, what is causing this dwindling of lesbian bar numbers, and what are the ones that are still holding on? Like, so she went on a tour of the US and went to a bunch of bars. She went to each bar at least twice, or at least she tried to go to each bar at least twice, sometimes with friends, sometimes without friends, sometimes with her husband, who's a trans man. And this is important because she talks about how lesbian bars have positioned themselves as inclusive spaces, and that's part of how they have managed to survive into the 21st century. Spaces that are trans friendly, that are friendly towards women of all stripes and so on. And so, yeah, it was interesting. Like, this tour is quite immersive. You really get caught up in every bar and what makes each bar unique. But also, on some level, it feels samey because outside of some exceptions, maybe the only bar that's run by black women or the only bar that's run by a Latina, a lot of these spaces read as quite white. Maybe it's just me, but she points out when she's the minority or when it's a diverse crowd and so on. And so I think there's some questions I was left with, which it would be interesting to watch more interviews and read more interviews and so on. And I hope to do that, like listen to podcast episodes where she talks about this, just to hear what else came up in those travels that didn't necessarily end up in the book. Then the last book I finished in the week ending 22nd October 2023 was Family Meal by Brian Washington. This is a book that centers on two characters, one of whom has recently moved back to Houston from Los Angeles after he lost his boyfriend, and the other whom has stayed in Houston during, you know, the length of the time they've known each other, and the bakery that belongs to the family of the second character. So these two characters grew up with each other. One of them actually lived in the other's home. I should just give names so that it helps. Cam is the one who's coming from LA back to Houston, and TJ is the one who stayed in Houston. So Cam has lost his boyfriend Kai and is coming back to basically pull himself back together and figure out his life, because it's been a momentous loss, and over time Washington reveals to us how that loss came to be, and it's quite heartbreaking. Honestly, I think it's heartbreaking to lose somebody you love, but the way in which he loses the person he loves is particularly heartbreaking and particularly traumatic. Anyway, so he goes back to Houston and for a while lives with a couple, a gay couple who he meets, but then ends up living with TJ, who he lived with as a child. TJ's family took him in when he was a child after he lost his parents. So he's encountered these great losses in his life, and now he's back with a family that has loved him since he was a child, and he's trying to figure out what it means to be a grown-up, to be grieving, and not necessarily coping in the healthiest of ways, while also navigating this friendship that has changed. The contours of the friendship have changed over the time they've been apart, and now they're back together, him and TJ. TJ is Korean American, and Kai, and by Korean American I mean, this is important, he has a black mother and a Korean father. And Kai was black and a translator of Japanese literature to English. So I think, as is often the case with Brian Washington's writing, Japan shows up, you know, as it did in Memorial, and if I remember correctly, in Lot also. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, so there's a lot of food, there's a lot of gayness. Like, if you're uncomfortable with sex, do not read this book. Also, if you're uncomfortable with depictions of disordered eating, this is not the book for you, because that's part of what Cam is battling in the wake of his loss. I hope I'm not spoiling things, because it's not even any of these constituent parts that makes the book what it is, but the ways in which these people relate to each other, try to make space for each other in each other's lives, find love, lose love, make love, how they, especially navigate moving through the world as queer men who are trying to make sense of the world they live in, and whose difficulties in life don't come from their queerness, but who complicate their lives sometimes via their queerness, if that makes sense. So yeah, it was such a good book. I read it so fast. I would keep saying, I'm just going to read one more chapter, then I'll sleep. Then I'd find myself 3 chapters in, and this is a Brian Washington Stan account now. But yeah, please read it if you can. It's newly out, and I'm so surprised that I got it as soon as I did, but I'm happy I picked it up and read it because I really enjoyed it. So yeah, those are the books I read in the week ending 22nd October 2023. Please tell me what books you've read recently and what you enjoyed, what books have stood out to you, and so on. And like, share, subscribe, and all the good things. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.